Orbit, the story of the triumph of John Herschel Glenn, Jr. And here is NBC News correspondent Frank McGee.
A great sigh rose across the land this afternoon as millions of Americans experienced the end of an intensely moving experience. The emotions felt privately by each of us, but at the same time shared in common with a good part of humanity, were compounded, I think, of prayerful thanksgiving and enormous relief. Only after these, I believe, did we permit ourselves to feel a justifiable touch of pride. We had, after all, anticipated so long this country's first effort to place a man in orbit. We had encountered so many maddening delays. We had feared, each of us, for the safety of the chosen astronaut, John Glenn, this despite the knowledgeable assurances of the officials most intimately connected with the project and of Colonel Glenn himself. We had, on a memorable day in January, moved to within 20 minutes of launching time, only to see the vast effort defeated again by weather. And finally, we reached today, February 20th. And we had, by this time, it seems to me, reached something bordering on hypnosis, irresistibly drawn to the event and at the same time repelled by our fears of what might happen. I think some of us tried to spare ourselves from living those crucial moments by tending to believe, even when the launching was only a few minutes away, that something would happen and the flight would again be postponed. But then, inexorably it seemed, the elaborate ritual continued and the clock gnawed away at the remaining moments of delusion that we had permitted ourselves. The launch occurred. It was both frightening and beautiful. And then for almost 5 hours, few people in the civilized world allowed their thoughts to stray very far from the American in space. It was at the end of those 5 hours when word was flashed that Colonel Glenn had landed safely at the end of 3 orbits and had been brought hale and hearty aboard a ship in the Atlantic, then that the great sigh arose. With the comforting knowledge that all ended well, we will now relive some of those moments, beginning in reverse order and seeing what happened not first but last. Our great good luck that we had hoped would prevail and allow us to bring you motion pictures of the recovery of Colonel Glenn at sea did not hold, and we do not have those motion pictures. However, we do have some still pictures made of Colonel Glenn shortly after he came aboard the USS Noah, the destroyer that affected his recovery. The first picture you see is Colonel Glenn in the wardroom of the Noah, being stripped of his spacesuit. You can see that the sensors are still attached to his body, and this was the very beginning of the immediate medical debriefing. And then a few moments later, Colonel Glenn was lying on the couch, and the photographers caught him with an enormous smile on his face as he began to actually undergo the first of several intensive physical examinations that he will be given in the next 48 hours. And a few moments later, another picture was made of Colonel Glenn on the telephone. He was still lying on the table and the doctors were making the physical examination. And it is our understanding that this picture was made while Colonel Glenn was in voice communication with President Kennedy, who had called from the White House in Washington. And then at 8:04 Eastern Standard Time this evening, Colonel Glenn completed the routine aboard the carrier Randolph and left by jet plane for Grand Turk Island, where he will undergo the intensive and extensive debriefings tonight and tomorrow. Debriefing is a term that means that doctors and technicians will attempt to get him to recall all of his reactions during the flight. These will include both the physical and the emotional or psychological reactions. To those of us who have never had an adventure as monumental as the one Glenn experienced today, it's hard to imagine what he has, in fact, gone through. But now let's begin to take a closer look at Glenn's entire day, and that report is coming up. Now to Whitfield Connor, speaking for Gulf.
Here's news of importance to every motorist using premium or super premium gasoline. Now, Gulf lowers your cost of driving with a great new gasoline, the finest premium gasoline ever made. New No-Nox, the gasoline that gives you super premium features at no extra cost. Yes, super premium features at no extra cost. What does this mean to you? Simply this. If you're a premium gasoline user, now in new No-Nox at usual premium prices, you get the same costly additives formerly available only in Gulf's super premium gasoline, Gulf Crest. That's right. At no extra cost, you get the same famous Crest additives that help maintain clean engine performance and power, prolong the life of your spark plugs, and save on costly engine servicing. And if you're a super premium user, now you can use new No-Nox and save on every gallon. New No-Nox at your Gulf dealers now.
And in the last few moments, we have received transmission of still two more still photographs of the recovery of Colonel Glenn and the bringing aboard of the astronaut on the USS destroyer Noah. So let's take a look at those now. I'm sure you would want to see them. May we have the picture of Colonel Glenn as he's coming aboard the destroyer? There he is now in his spacesuit. He is out of the capsule, as you can see. This was made aboard the USS Noah. I believe we have still one more picture, do we not? Fine. And this is the capsule itself being lifted from the water by a crane aboard the destroyer. At this point, Colonel Glenn was still inside the capsule. In fact, about 25 minutes later, they blasted the escape hatch away so that he could step out onto the deck of the ship. Of course, Colonel Glenn has been training for today's orbital flight for nearly 3 years. It was that long training period which made the interminable delays in Mercury Atlas 6, the delays going all the way back to last December, made those delays bearable and livable. John Glenn was awakened this morning by the astronaut's doctor and was told again that this might be the day. It was 2:20 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the Atlas booster stood silently on its pad while Lieutenant Colonel Powers briefed newsmen on each detail of his awakening. This was the scene at that time. 2:20 this morning, Eastern Standard Time at Cape Canaveral. Colonel Powers briefing reporters on the situation.
After a little shave and shower, he had breakfast at 2:45. And a little change in routine this morning. We had a quiet breakfast with just John, Dr. Douglas, Deke Slayton. I was a little bit late, but I had breakfast too. Breakfast had scrambled eggs, the standard filet, little fruit juice, toast, jelly, and some postum. Postum. Orange juice. Orange juice. This is Florida, you know.
But soon it would be outer space, and so John Glenn must be suited up. The frail body of man cannot, after all, survive without elaborate protection. His silvery spacesuit is another backup protection against the hostile elements. Colonel Glenn appeared at ease and unconcerned about the dangers he must have known that he faced. Finally, he left his quarters in Hangar S.
Inside the hangar, and there comes Colonel John Glenn, the astronaut, walking along carrying his portable air conditioning unit. It seems to be a new type of unit this time. Walking beside him is the doctor, Bill Douglas, and up the 4 steps now and into the transfer van. His helmet is on this morning. He's not carrying it in his hand. A couple of the doctors and technicians boarding the van with him. Dr. Howard Minners, as well as Dr. Douglas, his personal physician. The men beginning to move around the transfer van now, getting the door shut, beginning to get ready to unplug the ground power supply. This van carries its own motor for producing its electricity in motion. The astronaut goes inside, moves to the back of the transfer van. He'll take his seat there in a sort of reclining chair. All of his instruments will be plugged into the devices which monitor his heart rate, blood pressure, breathing rate while he's going out to the pad. One of the truck technicians now pulling the ground power plug off the side of the truck, and the truck will begin to move out very soon.
It was Richard Bate describing the scene as Colonel Glenn entered the transportation van and was moved to pad 14. Herb Kaplow continues the description as the van nears the service tower and Colonel Glenn prepares to dismount and climb the elevator to his capsule, Friendship 7.
And here is Pilot Glenn stepping out now, switching the portable air cooler from his left to his right hand, then back to his left, and he moves his way around the front of the truck on launch pad 14, moving along some of the superstructure of the tower and smiling and waving his hand for a moment to some of the workmen there and shaking hands for a moment. And now stepping into the elevator, followed by Dr. Douglas, by suit technician Schmidt, by astronaut Deke Slayton, and the elevator is still poised at the first level. The doors close and the elevator now starts to ascend to the 11th deck. Inside the 11th deck white room, astronaut Glenn steps in and is patted on the arm by a couple of the workmen on the 11th deck who are dressed in their white smocks and white caps. The astronaut shakes hands with another member of the white room crew, stands off to the side, and if he follows custom and simulations, probably is asking the pad leader, where does the pad crew stand in the count? In short, is the spacecraft ready to receive him? He's looking at some papers now and hands one to the pad leader. Is talking and looking again at some documents in front of him. They appear to be index cards of sorts. This white room is designed to be as free of dust as possible to keep the spacecraft from gathering any dust or any rust. The astronaut now adjusts the small package over his chest, which is a mirror, and beneath that, life raft, a small life preserver beneath that. The mirror is there so that cameras behind his head in the spacecraft can shoot from their angle and by the reflection of the mirror discern the expressions on the astronaut's face. John Glenn standing there, and there is a trace of a smile now as he listens and bends his head for a moment. Some strong light off to the side shining into the room, and that is the pad leader Günther Wendt, who was a flight engineer in the German Luftwaffe during the war. Is now the top man, the boss in charge of the white room, where the activity is now concentrated. This is John Glenn's second trip for the real thing to the white room, and it doesn't seem to have shaken him from his facial expressions, frequently smiling as he chats with other members of the crew. Joe Schmidt, the suit technician, with earphones over his white pilot-type cap. He, by now, has probably laid out the restraining straps in the spacecraft so that Glenn doesn't lie on them when he moves in. A NASA inspector, and now Glenn walks up the few steps and is removing the dust galoshes, smiling as he chats with other members of the crew. Joe Schmidt, the suit technician, with earphones over his white pilot-type cap. He, by now, has probably laid out the restraining straps in the spacecraft so that Glenn doesn't lie on them when he moves in. A NASA inspector, and now Glenn walks up the few steps and is removing the dust galoshes, the overshoes, which are to protect his shoes and keep them as free of dirt as possible. And momentarily, they're off now, and puts his right, then left foot in and moves in first part of his body through the hatch, holding on with both hands for a moment or so, then with one hand on a hold bar above the relatively small hatchway, making his way very carefully into the capsule, into the spacecraft, and is being helped by the suit technician Joe Schmidt and by a NASA technician, the NASA inspector.
Streeter of GU 308, 3108, Mr. Streeter.
And thus was the stage set for the first orbital flight by an American. He maneuvered himself into the capsule at 6:30 a.m. But because of a balky bolt on the hatch door and some less minor delays for weather, it was to be more than 3 hours before he would be launched into space. We go back now to 9:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time this morning, 1 minute before the actual liftoff. We will offer no supplemental commentary, none is needed, and the only voice you will hear will be that of Colonel John Powers, reporting from the Nerve Center, Mercury Control, for the liftoff.
T-minus 10 seconds and counting. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. The MA-6 vehicle has lifted off. The MA-6 vehicle has lifted off. Trajectory looks good. The MA-6 vehicle is off the launch pad at 47 minutes after the hour. It is climbing nicely. All systems are reported go. Range safety reports it is all green. The MA-6 vehicle is climbing quickly. The trajectory is still A-OK. The MA-6 vehicle is still climbing nicely. The MA-6 vehicle is climbing nicely, has passed through the area of maximum dynamic pressures. Pilot John Glenn is reporting all systems go, is giving routine reports, reading off his instruments. John Glenn reports the flight very smooth now. The MA-6 launch vehicle is proceeding on its pre-planned trajectory. John Glenn reports his cabin pressure now holding at 6.1 pounds per square inch. The MA-6 vehicle is still climbing on its trajectory. John Glenn reports the G-forces building now to 6. Booster engine cutoff has been confirmed by the pilot.
And so those critical and exceedingly dangerous early moments of the flight were behind him. Colonel Glenn's capsule, named the Friendship 7, was, a few moments later, inserted into orbit. And at this point, it was the words of Glenn himself which told the story best. And that report is coming up. We'll be back after this message from Gulf, and speaking for Gulf, Whitfield Connor.
Go back from this modern refinery to the beginning of petroleum energy. Don't stop there. Go back to the source of all energy, the sun, 300 million years ago. Take the energy of the sun, release it, change it, turn energy into matter, and matter into life, generation after generation. Bury what remains of that life under layers of sediment and squeeze. In a few 100 million years, you're ready to roll up your sleeves and retrieve the sun's life-giving energy in the new and wondrous form of petroleum. Now you've got to find where it's hidden and get it out and move it on its way. But that's how oil, the greatest source of energy in the world, comes to you. To warm you, to work for you, to protect you. Gulf is energy at work to get the most and best energy out of the Earth's oil deposits. This is the dedicated purpose of the Gulf Oil Corporation, all of Gulf, to bring you more and better energy from oil for whatever the work there is to be done.
Among the restrictions placed on the coverage of Glenn's flight was one which prohibited live or instantaneous broadcast of his voice communications from the space capsule to the tracking stations around the world. However, those communications were recorded, and within minutes they were released by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And from the 5-hour flight, we've attempted to distill some of the more cogent comments, starting with Glenn's communications with Mercury Control at the moment of liftoff.
3, 2, 1, 0.
Liftoff. Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. Roger, reading you loud and clear. Roger, we're programming it roll okay. Fuel 102, 101, oxygen 78, 100, amps 27. Roger, loud and clear, flight path is good, 69. Roger, check's okay. Mine was 70 on your mark. Have some vibration area coming up here now. Roger, reading you loud and clear, John.
With Glenn nearing the Canary Islands, this report about his flight from Colonel John Powers at Mercury Control.
The Friendship 7 spacecraft has passed on its orbital track, has now passed over the Canaries, and is about to establish contact with our tracking station at Kano in Africa. As it passed in the vicinity of the Canaries, John Glenn reported, "I am very comfortable. All systems are okay." He reported that the horizon was a brilliant blue and that he had the Canaries in sight out through his window.
Quite a little bit later, with the first orbit almost complete, another report from Colonel Powers.
As he passed across the east coast of the United States, he reported he had a beautiful view of the coast. He, at that time, could not see the Cape, but expected to do so shortly. He has now passed east of Bermuda, going down the second leg of the second orbit in the Friendship 7 spacecraft.
At this point, Glenn was operating the capsule manually, and a long-awaited announcement from Project Mercury.
In a voice contact broadcast and relayed remotely to the control center, we heard astronaut John Glenn report that he is go for another orbit. Our analysis of the situation at this time is that we are in a go condition. Our flight director, Mr. Chris Kraft, has made a preliminary decision at this time that we are go and will continue the mission.
Now, over the United States, another critical point in the climax of the mission and a tense double check.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire. Retro fire. Roger. Retros are firing. Oh, Roger, baby. DC current Vegas 09. Feels like I'm going back toward Hawaii.
And then Glenn was down. The carrier and the destroyer were on their way, and a Project Mercury announcement that the world awaited.
The USS Noah indicate the Friendship 7 spacecraft was picked up clear of the water at 1 minute after 3, and finally set down on the deck at 4 minutes after 3 this afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. John Glenn reports, "My condition is excellent."
It appears tonight that over 60 million Americans watched the flight on television and heard those words earlier today. And not the least of these was President John F. Kennedy. Reporters at the White House, by sly glances through the window of his offices in the executive wing, saw Mr. Kennedy peering intently at his television set. It had been agreed with the television industry pool that the president would have some comment to make on the flight when it was concluded. And when Colonel Glenn was picked out of the Atlantic Ocean, the president did appear before our television cameras.
I know that I expressed the great happiness and thanksgiving of all of us that Colonel Glenn has completed his trip, and I know that this is particularly felt by Mrs. Glenn and his two children. A few days ago, Colonel Glenn came to the White House and visited me. And he was, as are the other astronauts, the kind of American of whom we are most proud. Some years ago, as a Marine pilot, he raced the sun across this country and lost. And today, he won. I also want to say a word for all those who participated with Colonel Glenn at Canaveral. They faced many disappointments and delays. The burdens upon them were great, but they kept their heads and they made a judgment, and I think their judgment's been vindicated. We have a long way to go in the space race. We started late, but this is the new ocean, and I believe the United States must sail on it and be in a position second to none. Some months ago, I said that I hope that every American would serve his country. Today, Colonel Glenn served his, and we all express our thanks to him.
By this time, tribute was pouring in from around the nation and indeed from around the world. Perhaps the most enthusiastic tribute occurred midway between Columbus, Ohio and Wheeling, West Virginia, in Glenn's hometown of New Concord, Ohio. There, practically all 2,000 residents turned out at the Muskingum College Gymnasium to pray for, worry through, and cheer on the astronaut. The climax to their vigil was the arrival of the Glenn parents, who left their home only after they knew that their son was safe. And this was the scene at that time.
There it is, Mrs. Glenn and John Glenn Sr., a very lovely couple, America's first couple right at this moment. Mrs. Glenn wearing a little black hat. She's wearing an orchid. She's being escorted by President Robert Montgomery of Muskingum College. Bill Cutting, a state patrolman, going along in front of me here. Mr. Glenn is being escorted by Mayor J.K. Taylor of New Concord. And everyone in this gymnasium at this moment is standing up and applauding as Mr. and Mrs. John Glenn go through the rostrum to begin the news conference on a day that is not only historic for them, but for all of America and all of the free world.
What were your thoughts, and particularly, was there ever a moment when you feared that the flight would not be successful?
That's a hard question to answer, part of it. Feelings are something that you just cannot put into words. But answering the part about wondering about the flight, there never has been a moment since John was chosen for Project Mercury that we had any doubts as to his success when he did take the flight, which was today. And right now, I'm so very, very thankful to God for his safety and for the success of the mission which went today.
Thank you.
Mr. Glenn, John received a good bit of training, 3 years or more, to be able to stand up under all this. You and Mrs. Glenn received none of this training. How have you managed to stand up under the barrage of attention, camera crews and reporters that have been living almost with you for the past 5 weeks or so?
Oh, yeah, we've enjoyed that very much. We've certainly been a wonderful bunch of people. And the first few times that we met the press, I think the first time we went to the door and there was 5 men standing there. And they started to introduce themselves, you know. Well, I can't remember one name, let alone a dozen. I said, well, come on in. As far as I'm concerned.